Welcome to part 1 of the Tamiya 1/12 scale Ducati Panigale S 1199 model kit build. A quick word on why I find this so interesting before we dive into the actual sprues and instructions and such like, however. Ducati, for anybody that knows them, knows anything about them or had a fascination with them, have always been known to be innovators in the world of motorcycle manufacture, and the Panigale is certainly no exception. Now, apart from having a brand new L-twin or V-twin engine, which is one of Ducati's unique aspects, using the desmodromic valve system and what have you, the entire bike is new. The whole concept of the bike is new because it's the very first road bike ever to have been made that does not use a frame at all. Everything is hinged around the engine being the main structural component. On top of the engine sits an aluminium airbox which the front steering stem goes through, the forks and what have you. Subframe bolts onto the rear, the tank sits on the top sealing off the airbox, and then the swing arm bolts onto the rear of the engine, so it has no frame at all, unlike modern sports bikes which typically use an aluminium beam frame in the case of the Japanese competitors, and with earlier Ducatis it would use a steel chromoly trellis frame, which essentially does the same thing. It's just thinner and lighter and allows the bike to be slimmer and what have you. But this one really sort of broke the mould completely by just doing away with it totally, taking its cues from the Desmo Sedici, which is the Ducati GP bike, which uses a similar idea but with a very small partial trellis frame to form the headstock unit, whereas this just uses the airbox instead. So it's a fascinating machine, and we're just going to jump now into the sprues and the instructions and what have you. Now, the first thing you should always do with any kit, regardless of how simple or how complicated it seems, have a good read through the instructions and 2 or 3 times go through them in good detail and have a really good look through. Several reasons for this. When you do this, you can actually figure out for yourself what the best method of assembly is. With bike kits particularly, it always helps to sub-assemble some components before you do others. And for this reason, it's not necessarily the best way forward to just follow step by step the pages as they occur. This will get you the desired results, of course, but if you follow this page by page, you'll realise that there are bits that you could have done earlier and all kinds of things. So, for example, things like the paddock stand here, things like the front mudguard, which is in 2 halves, things like the petrol tank, which is in 2 halves, which we'll see up here and what have you. There's no reason why these can't be sub-assembled, prepped, seam lines eradicated and what have you before you get into doing any of the other bits. So have a good read through. Something else I always do is take a pen and make colour call-outs for the various components, especially so with any model kit, because the manufacturer will always do colour call-outs for, in this case, their own paints, Tamiya paints, whether they be acrylic or enamel or what have you. In Airfix case they would use Humbrol, in Academy's case they would use whoever they're sort of allied with in the paint world, and so on. What I tend to do is use a mix of paints. For example, if I'm doing metallic, realistic shiny metallic finishes, I use Alclad. If I'm using certain other dull sheen metallic finishes, I use Humbrol metal coats. If I'm using matte colours, I do tend to favour Tamiya acrylics. They're particularly good for their matte finishes and very quick drying. But for gloss finishes, I will usually use Humbrol because they have a vast range of paints available, vast range of colours, and the finish is far superior to anything you get from a bottle of acrylic paint, I find. So as a result of that, I will always do colour call-outs for whatever I'm going to paint certain components. This helps as well because there's nothing more annoying than getting your airbrush out, airbrushing a stack of bits, and then cleaning it all out, putting it away, and then realising that there are 5 or 6 more bits on a sprue that you could have sprayed at the same time. Not the end of the world, but just a little bit frustrating. So first thing I'm going to do here, having had a good read through the instructions, is I'm going to remove from the sprue a few parts and start doing a little bit of a sub-assembly of some parts on here, these being the engine, the airbox, the petrol tank, the front mudguard or fender if you wish, and so on. And we're going to put a few bits and pieces together and look at where we stand there, and the modifications to the discs or rotors, depending on which side of the pond you're on, as you can see here, have been carried out. So all the discs have been drilled using a very fine drill bit in a pin vise, including the slots just above the bobbins, and the bobbins as well that hold it on the floating disc onto the caliper. And the same for the rear disc brake, as you can see there. And this just adds, I find, a bit more realism, because while they're moulded indented, they just don't look quite right once they're painted, whereas with this it's worth that time that it takes to sit and do it, because it adds more realism. What we're going to do next is move on to priming of all the bits on the sprues, plus the bits that have been pre-assembled. The pre-assembled bits are as follows: the front mudguard or fender, the fuel tank, the engine, although the sump and the right side engine cover and the rocker covers have been left separate because they are a separate shade, so they're going to be painted, they're all going to be painted separately and then added afterwards. The airbox stroke front yoke, fork carrier and the subframe have all been assembled, and they're all sitting waiting to be sprayed, and they're mounted on cocktail sticks or something similar so that they can be sat to dry. The rest of the parts at the moment are left on the sprues, and some parts will be removed and the primer touched up on the cleaned areas and then painted off the sprues. But it's easier to do the whole priming with everything on the sprues just for the moment, because you're doing a lot more of the model, so to take everything off the sprues and mount everything separately on cocktail sticks would be a pain in the backside. So we're going to go right ahead, take this sprue and the other two and give everything a good priming using Humbrol Enamel. I usually use Humbrol Enamel, and it would be either white, yellow, grey or black, depending on the model that I'm doing. Now, if I'm spraying metallics over, it really doesn't matter what colour the base primer coat is, because metallics cover very, very well. If I'm spraying a red, I typically spray a yellow primer coat, because apparently it allows the red to shine through better, although I've never actually noticed that myself, I've got to be honest. I've never noticed a big difference between a yellow primer coat and a grey primer coat. But the one that really does make a difference is if you're spraying a pale colour such as whites, yellows, as anything with a low pigmentation, then a white undercoat really, really does make a difference, and it takes much less coverage afterwards. In this case, because the bike's going to be red, I'm going to be using a yellow primer undercoat for everything because it's just easier. And we're going to go ahead and get that done right now. Back shortly. Okay, well that's the prep work done. We've drilled the brake discs and cleaned up a few seam lines, that kind of thing, and now everything's been primed in a yellow primer, which is a Humbrol Enamel. Up here we have the sprues and the bits and pieces in my simple homemade drying box. This is basically just to stop dust particles and bits of rubbish sticking to the paint before it's completely set, which does happen. All it is a plastic tub with a plastic sheet taped over the front. The reason I do it this way rather than using a tub and sitting it upside down on the components, as some people do, is if you do it this way, you see, like I've done there with the sprues, you can actually stand them up inside the box against the walls, leaving room to sit the other bits and pieces up, whereas you'd have to devise some kind of holder to place the box over them. So just a little food for thought there if anybody's thinking of doing that. So as you can see, everything's primed in yellow, and you can see the petrol tank there, and panels at the back, the exhaust there, and the airbox and the swinging arm, the subframe just there, and the paddock stand, the stand just there. So leave that covered, and once that's dry, we'll be back with an inspection of those and then start looking at which top coats we're going to apply first. So thank you for watching so far.